this one on? Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining us this evening for this Ebor lecture. I'm Dr. Esther McIntosh, I'm Professor Esther McIntosh. I'm the Director of the Centre for Religion in Society, and I'm on the Ebor Committee, and we are delighted to have our spring Ebor lecture here today. So in case you're not aware, the Ebor Lectures in Theology and Public Life were established in 2006 here in York to promote conversation across a diversity of religious beliefs and issues of public concern. The Ebor Lectures are offered free of charge to the general public, providing a space where experts and practitioners from a range of communities such as educational institutions, public interest groups, religious movements, charitable and political organisations can share knowledge and provoke reflection, contributing to creative, personal and collective decision-making for the benefit of society. Previous speakers have included archbishops, cabinet ministers, social activists, journalists, astronomers, peace workers, authors and many others. We're now meeting twice a year, and the Ebor Lectures are an ecumenical project jointly sponsored and organised by York Minster, the Methodist Church, Yorkshire North and East District, the C&JB Morale Trust, York Area Society of Friends of the Quakers, and the Centre for Religion Society here at York St John University. And for today's Ebor lecture, I'm delighted to welcome Rupert Reid, who is co-director of the Climate Majority Project and Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of East Anglia. Rupert is also a former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion and a former Green Party councillor. In 2018, Rupert refused to debate with a climate change denier on the BBC, leading to a change in their policy. And he was instrumental in persuading the UK Parliament to declare a climate change emergency in 2019. Rupert's academic expertise is in the fields of ecological and political philosophy, philosophy of language, philosophy of the sciences, and philosophy of film. He's the author of numerous books and articles on Wittgenstein, as well as publishing widely on the climate, including books written for non-academic audiences. His 2022 titles include Why Climate Breakdown Matters and Do You Want to Know the Truth? He's also published a book on the Climate Majority Project itself, and there will be copies of this outside afterwards, as well as some of Rupert's other books, should you wish to purchase a copy. After Rupert's talk, there will be time for questions from the audience, and then there will be a drinks reception outside. The title of Rupert's talk tonight is Earth Hope: How Through the Coming Climate Chaos We Will Come to Find Common Cause in a Spiritual Orientation to Our Planetary Home. Thank you, Rupert.
Thanks, Esther, for that thoughtful introduction, and it is a pleasure and an honour to be here to give this 2024 Ebor lecture. So let's get this lecture started. It's the end. It's the end, but the moment has been prepared for. We're preparing for it right now by being here together, by having the courage to step into this space. You are preparing. But of what is it the end? When I opened this lecture by saying it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for, did your mind or heart lurch straight to apocalypse? That is, to complete civilizational meltdown? If so, this is probably because we half want it. We want to be saved from the endless and difficult task of having to keep trying, of having to act as our greatest selves in what will be an endlessly difficult future. But also our minds lurch to apocalypse because that is a way in which we make ourselves safe against it. So on the one hand, this tendency, this secret lurching towards a terrible endgame, shows first our fragility, our proto-doomism, our appreciation of how very bad things might be, are, the great taboo. Our desire not to have to struggle against immense odds anymore. Our desire to be able to give up. But on the other hand, this tendency also shows our deep desire and determination to become resilient inside. We imagine the worst so that we can prepare ourselves for it, at least psychologically. And as inside, so outside. Together, we will confront this greatest crisis. Together, we will resilientize. We will overcome our separateness. We will find a greatest meaning. This great crisis will give us what we desperately need, that great meaning. What I named this lecture for, Earth Hope, which is the same thing as hope for humanity. A new hope, a radical hope that begins when we let go of the old hopeless hope that if we stick our hearts in the sand, all of this horror show will just go away. A new hope that is thoroughly and with determination active. This civilization is coming to an end. But it doesn't have to end in abject collapse. We don't know that it will end in that way. Resist the siren call of an excessive knowingness that pretends to exterminate all hope. Yeah, this civilization might be endable by way of what would be on balance a magnificent transformation. That's the great hope I'm here to deliver. This is the good news. My message is one of absolutely brutal realism, and out of that very realism springs a far greater hope than any that our impoverished culture offers in its aspirationalism, in its politics, or in the vast majority of its artistic imaginations at present. This all begins with recognizing outwardly what at some level we already recognize inwardly. Time is up for the age of progress and endless growth. We are in what Churchill, in similar though actually less desperate circumstances, called the age of consequences. We are out of the safe zone. Sadly, it's now a childish illusion to think that anyone or anything is going to successfully and safely fix this and allow us to sail blithely on. This is not something, in any case, that is fixable. It's not any kind of problem. It's so much bigger and more wicked than that. It's not the kind of thing that can be fixed, it won't be solved. It's a new condition we're all going to inhabit permanently from now on. And it's going to keep transforming. And for a long time, even if we get our act together, it's going to keep worsening. It's a tragic situation, like a tragic Shakespearean flaw that we're prone to. It's something we have to, in a very profound way, get used to. It's not a problem to be solved, it's a basically permanent predicament, a permacrisis. They say, my friends say, it's an emergency, but even that understates it. What do I mean? Well, think about emergencies. Emergencies are situations where there is great urgency, yes, and emergencies are situations where you can do something about that emergency such that the emergency comes to an end. That is not the kind of situation we are in. Basically, now that we have ejected ourselves from the safe zone, this is never going to end. So calling it an emergency understates it. The horrible truth is that the climate emergency, or rather the climate more than emergency, is going to go on getting worse for a very long time to come, and that some of us are going to end up being killed by it. That, with virtual certainty, includes people in this room. If you imagine that this is really just about your children or grandchildren, or just about people in faraway countries of which you know little, you are fooling yourself. Even opinion polls now show that many people know this. More and more of us sense it. And though these are difficult truths, people aren't just curling up in a ball. Why? Well, partly because more and more of us now sense that more and more of us now sense it. They say there are two stages to true transformational change. The first stage is when pretty much everyone realizes we can't go on like this. The second stage is when pretty much everyone realizes that pretty much everyone else realizes also that we can't go on like this. So if you're feeling it, and my guess is that at some level you are, or you probably wouldn't have turned up. If you're feeling it, you're not alone, you're not mad. In fact, if you're feeling this already, then you are very sane. You are a vanguard of mental health. Because mental health now sometimes means feeling fearful, even perhaps depressed or desperate. If you aren't sometimes afraid now, afraid of the crucible we're heading into, then you don't understand it. If you don't sometimes suffer yet from eco-anxiety, then you're not paying attention. These kinds of feelings, when evoked by the crisis that we have entered into, are not pathological. On the very contrary. We are part of the Earth system. We are that part of the Earth system which is registering what is desperately awry with that system. And indeed, some of those feelings, such as feelings of guilt or shame, also in a different way anger, are arising also because of us, because of what we have done or not done, which has sent the system awry. And these feelings make sense most of all because what they are is actually spurs to act, spurs to the realization that there is something profoundly wrong with where we're at. So, rather than people giving up, serious climate concern and action is at last starting to hit the mainstream as we wake up en masse, not only to our predicament, but to others waking up to it too. Fed up of business as usual, and with our reasonable demands having been thus far largely unmet, people are taking matters into their own hands. Ordinary people and elites too, people of all kinds. What do I mean by this? I mean things that are bubbling up, mostly still below the radar, across the country, in fact across the world. Things that are examples, crucial examples of, as I say, people in very ordinary and practical and weighty ways taking matters into their own hands. I mean things like community climate action, that is exemplified, for example, by the wonderful iFarm that I'm on the board of. This is on the Norfolk-Suffolk border, 10 acres of land. Soon there'll be a lot more bought by a bunch of ordinary folks who've got together and bought it, and who are now turning it into not just a place for growing food and for rewilding, but into a kind of ever-growing community hub. They've taken over a local pub, for example. I'm a small investor in that pub. They're running it as a social enterprise, and they're really trying to reach out to the whole community, including conservative-minded Brexit people, of whom there are plenty in that part of the world, and trying to get them on the inside of this emerging phenomenon, community climate action. I mean too things like what's happening in quite a number of professions now, what's happening among people who have woken up or who are getting engaged in advertising and in insurance and in the law. People are seeking to change their corporations that they work for, to make them climate compliant, or who are resisting taking on work for fossil fuel companies, or who are doing pro bono work for climate protesters, and indeed for the Climate Majority Project that I run. I mean things like the organisation Wildcard, which is working impressively to rewild the royal lands, and is inviting huge numbers of people into a campaign which has in it all sorts of ordinary people, and also people like our supporter Chris Packham. People have been thinking for quite a while about the $64 billion question. How do we break beyond the usual suspects? How can we get beyond people who self-identify as activists and appeal, well, ultimately to everyone, or at least to the majority? There is already a majority of people in this country, and in most countries in the world, who are fairly deeply concerned. What needs to happen is that concern needs to be deepened further, and that can happen when we really start to face the truth together. And partly thereby, this climate majority needs to be and can be thoroughly activated. We need 1,000, 10,000 of the organisations that I've just mentioned that are starting to spring up. We need thousands of such flowers to bloom. The Emerging Climate Majority Project, of which I'm a director, is a rallying point for people, ordinary people, not a small radical flank, not just activists, ordinary people like parents, grandparents, business people, lawyers, artists, teachers, priests, food growers, retirees, and many more, who understand the depth of the crisis and who want to do something meaningful about it. The Climate Majority Projects bring together those who, in religions and civic associations, in neighbourhoods and communities, in workplaces and professions, are through with outsourcing the responsibility to others. Someone else is going to fix it? No. Through with thinking that scientists or governments or technologists or business people or activists are going to fix this by themselves, and who are instead determined to do our best together to influence the process and to mitigate it and to adapt to climate damage, to cope with it, even to flourish through it, in spite of it, and indeed because of it. Because of it? What do I mean by that? This crisis is an enormous opportunity for meaning. Right here is a life's purpose, waiting for anyone and everyone who needs one. And I put it to you that there is nothing that our society, so full of anomie and of nihilism, nothing that we need more now, more than purpose. Now, this centrality to human beings of purpose is something which some have understood for a long time. I think, for example, of Viktor Frankl, who wrote a magnificent book called Man's Search for Meaning, wherein he explains, for example, the astonishing fact that in the concentration camps in World War II, which he survived along with a few others, there were things, it turned out, that were even more important than having food or water or shelter. And basically what those things amounted to was having meaning. People in those beyond terrible conditions who didn't have anything to live for would die even if they still had food and water. And people who did have something to live for would live even without it for an astonishingly long time. I think going further back of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, what human beings above all need is something to will, something to put their determination into. We have been lacking that in this society. Well, now we have it again. We will find and are finding meaning in this time of great testing. We are going to be able to have truly amazing lives, not merely in spite of this permanent new predicament, but because of it. This is the wonderfulest truth about the climate crisis. There is something wonderful contained within the horrible truth of our predicament. Okay, let me seek to try to explain slightly further this slightly paradoxical sounding claim that the awful situation that we are in will be the making of us. And thus that, in a way, it's even welcome. How is it even possible to make this kind of claim? Well, consider this mysterious pronouncement from the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He said, the remedy is in the evil. Look inside the evil and there you will find the remedy for it. So, inside the evil, that is self-imposed climate breakdown, is a wonderful gift of meaning, waiting to be harvested. Or consider the great remark by the German poet Hölderlin, who famously said, where the danger lies, there also lies the saving power. Where the danger lies, there also lies the saving power. So, in facing up to the crisis, in the painful realizations and emotions it evokes, lies our possible salvation. And let me now state plain the greatest reason why. When we allow ourselves to actually feel our pain, our fear, our grief, our anger, when we allow ourselves to actually feel these things, many millions of us, then we are ready to act with determination to ensure that what is coming does not take us all down with it. Our grief, our pain for the earth, our fear and care for one another, these are brought home to us by the crisis. They emerge, they live, they transform. They are brought home to our hearts. Earth, our one and only home, is brought home to us. We are brought down to earth in the most wonderful way. Your earth grief, your climate distress, these can be transformed into earth hope and climate courage. Starting with the following crucial point. It takes courage to feel and face one's anxiety about the future. It takes courage to mourn. Blessed are those that mourn. It takes courage to allow oneself to own up to and express despair or depression. We need such great Churchillian courage. But that crucially includes the willingness to go there wherever there is, even when going there feels really difficult. How does all this work in a little more detail? How does change happen through the gathering and inaction of climate courage and through the growing ranks of the climate courageous? Well, let me seek to outline for you very briefly how we understand this in the Climate Majority Project. We see our work as having four essential and quintessentially interwoven strands. Start with collective awareness of our predicament. I was already talking about this earlier. The knowledge of the situation that we're in is already widespread. It will only spread further in the coming years. The weather, unfortunately, is our greatest recruiter. It is certain that there will be much more climate activism in the years to come. But we need something much bigger still than that. We need action that goes way beyond the usual suspects and encompasses many people who will never be activists. And I think it is incredibly likely that that will happen too. This collective awareness is spreading and growing, and it can start to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, a virtuous rather than a vicious circle. So again, the first stage of collective awareness is when everyone realises that everything has to change. The second stage is when everyone else gets included in that realisation. In other words, when everyone realises that everyone else is figuring it out too. As we come to see that together, then we sense make what we are doing into something massive and unavoidable. To vary Antonio Gramsci, this is optimism of the will combined with realism of the intellect. This is an enormously hopeful trajectory. The horrible truth about climate transforms into a wonderful truth about our emerging collective agency. The second strand of our theory of change is help in handling the full truth, which is, of course, in large part, a difficult truth, a truth about our predicament that seems and, well, is evil and dangerous. So what this second strand means is shared inner work, building inner climate resilience together. In the Climate Majority Project, this takes the form, for example, of our Climate Courage campaign, which aims to go into the spaces where climate distress is reliably produced. For example, educational institutions. If you teach students the truth about the world that they're growing up into, it's bound to be distressing. And what we say is that in those contexts, that distress must be resourced. It must be expected that it's going to be produced, and so students must be helped to deal with it. It's not some kind of optional extra add-on. It should be as essential as, for example, for a while now it's been recognised that war journalists will be traumatised often by what they see and experience. And they need to be provided as a matter of professional necessity with help to deal with those traumatising experiences. By the way, environmental journalists don't yet have such an assurance, and that's another area in which the Climate Courage campaign seeks to operate. There are many environmental and climate journalists now who are struggling with what they're seeing and what they're having to write about and what they're having to report on. They should be given such resourcing too. So the Climate Courage campaign aims to provide anywhere where climate distress is reliably produced, resourcing for that distress. And that's an instance of this more general truth, this second strand of our theory of change. We need help in handling the truth, and we need to find that help with each other. Next, when you get help handling the difficult truth, and when you have the collective awareness to build on, of the growing awareness of this crisis, then you can deepen your engagement with truth. You can go deeper into it. You can go deeper into looking rather than avoiding at where we're really at and where we're probably headed. And that's, among other things, what we're doing here today. And finally, and most crucially of all, action. So I've already said something to you about the kinds of actions that are supported and incubated and recommended by the Climate Majority Project. Ultimately, what the Climate Majority Project is about you. It's about everybody stepping into their power, finding their voice, wherever you have potential power, whether that be in your local community or in your workplace or wherever it might be. Action. Action is on this rendition I'm just giving you, the fourth and, in a way, obviously most crucial element of all of our theory of change. Action across the shop, action across the piece. But in the context of this being the Ebor lecture, let's think a bit more deeply about the psychospiritual dimension of all this. Our task, it should already be clear from what I've said thus far, is one of radical acceptance. We have to accept much more about ourselves and about the world than we perhaps want to. But this isn't acceptance in the sense of resignation. This isn't a cosmic shoulder shrug. Rather, accepting everything changes everything. Let me seek to explain. On first sight, there are micro and macro levels of acceptance. Accepting this moment, which is at the heart of most spiritual teaching and much religion, and accepting the state of the whole cosmos. The first, accepting this moment, is incredibly hard. People wouldn't spend years meditating if it wasn't. But it might nevertheless seem much easier then, and it might seem more desirable than the second. Should we really accept the state of the whole cosmos? Well, let's drill a bit more into what does accepting this moment mean? Accepting the present moment, the alpha and omega of spiritual wisdom, what holds all great wisdom traditions together, the crucialness of accepting this moment. But here's the thing. If you accept this moment as you sit down to, say, meditate, or as you gather together in a Quaker meeting, and you close off deliberately from your awareness pain, suffering, damage which is happening elsewhere in the world, then there's a sense in which you're in denial. You're closing yourself off from an aspect of this moment considered on the macro level. We can't keep the macro and the micro separate. We can't and shouldn't try to close off our awareness. And this is what's wrong with quite a lot of traditional religions, insofar as they sometimes seem to recommend withdrawal from the world. And this is what's wrong with quite a lot of New Age type stances, insofar as they seem to suggest that if we just take care of ourselves in the present moment, then everything else will sort itself out naturally. Religion and spirituality are worse than nothing if they actively prevent us from facing or doing anything about the state of the world, if they provide an avenue for merely quasi-permanently retreating from it. So, if we are to accept this moment, we have to be in a place of truly accepting the state of the whole world, overcoming the dualism between intellect and spirit on the one hand, and body and nature and society on the other. But again, accepting the state of the whole world, this might sound to you like resignation. But we start to understand how accepting everything itself creates the basis for changing everything, when we note how the state of the world as it is found by humans includes its being one of massive injustice and of dire climate decline. Those evaluative judgments that there is massive injustice in the world, that we are suffering from climate decline, these are part of any sane, humane description of the world. And further, we are part of each other. We are, to quote from the Lord of the Rings, part of this world. Drawing then on the great wisdom traditions, spiritually this moment is perfect, but its macro and its micro aspects must be inseparable. How is this possible without dualistic resignation? Okay, let me state quite directly my teaching on how accepting without duality yourself and the world will lead to dramatic macro as well as micro level change. It's this: when we accept everything, we also accept our grief, our terror, our rage at what is. It's dualistic to accept how things are, but to reject our intelligent emotional responses to how things are. Those responses are part of how things are. When we accept all, we accept our sense of justice and of injustice. We accept our sense of wholeness and of disturbance at its rupture. We accept our sense of beauty and of pain at its desecration. All these acceptances are what will power us through the great work ahead. These great, difficult emotions and responses and judgments are a critical part of what is and of what must be accepted. Whereas dualistic resignation that separates us from the world has to suppress our fear or suppress our anger. This is why traditional religion and New Age spirituality alike often tragically recommend exactly such suppression of normal, healthy emotional reactions. Gurus who tell us that if we still feel fear or anger, we are unenlightened, are by doing so proving themselves dramatically unqualified to speak about enlightenment. Rather than take such an outmoded route as theirs, a psychospiritual orientation for our time embraces these difficult emotions, such as eco-grief and our climate anxiety. It treats them as a necessary energy. It practices radical acceptance of them, and then they smoothly, naturally, undeniably move us into action. They put us in motion. Emotions are what put us in motion to do what is needful. We are internally related to the world, to each other. This is the great antidote to our spiritual impoverishment, to the story of separation that infects our civilization. Any genuine spirituality, especially today, is therefore inevitably an engaged spirituality. It doesn't dualistically divide us from the world or from our fellow suffering beings. It reminds us, rather, of our unity. So, this, I've been saying, is the end of something, but the moment has been prepared for, and we're continuing to prepare right now by deeply looking into and evoking these difficult, beautiful emotions, eco-grief and shame about the state of our institutions, our sinstitutions, and of our uncivilization. And all of this is love. Grief, anxiety, anger, shame, etc. are all really thoroughly grounded in care and in love. These emotions are there for a reason. Why are we grief-stricken? We are grief-stricken for what has been ripped from us, from what we care so deeply about that it's hard to imagine the world without it, without them, without such a being or whatever it is in it. Those who do not love cannot grieve. Eco-grief is, in my view, neglected relative to, say, eco-anxiety in our civilization. The power of grief is immense. It is the power of love through a glass both darkly and brightly. Earth grief, allowed to take new shape through grief work, what my teacher Joanna Macy has called despair and empowerment work, is a great piece of reconnective tissue, and thus a vigorous element of earth hope. Or again, why do we feel individual and collective shame vis-à-vis the state of climate and nature? We feel shame because something about what's being done sticks to us. We can't disassociate ourselves from it. Or if we don't feel shame about these matters, why perhaps should we? As a crude generalisation, I might make this remark. Climate shame is probably something more for the old. Climate anger probably something most for the young. Everyone has climate actions that are theirs and climate emotions that are theirs and that are right for them. The coming potential attestation of a more or less collective shame, a shame that is allowed and encouraged to take motion into significant and creative action, is another great component of Earth's hope. And once this kind of dynamic is in play, the dynamic that characterises eco-grief or eco-shame or eco-distress of any kind, then there is a sense in which whatever is threatened is protected. As the threat rises, we move spontaneously to address it, guided by our finest values and our deepest emotional responses. Whatever is threatened is protected in a reciprocal movement. True, some things have to be relinquished. This is what conventional activism, just like conventional politics, sometimes finds very hard to take. So, for instance, we are out of the safe zone on climate. The 1.5 degrees safe ceiling for global overheating that was agreed among the world's leaders is dead. But facing reality provides us with a mighty power, the rocket fuel that we gain, the rocket fuel that we are, that we become, when we take on board, for instance, that 1.5 is dead, and allow that awful realization, that realization full of awe, to really sink in. Facing reality provides us with more of a mighty power, that of true love. Relinquishment itself needn't be resignation. It can be the basis for a greater empowerment and energization. What is true love, by the way? Saint-Exupéry has a wonderful account of this. He says, we've got this romantic vision of love. Our vision of true love, our prototypical image of it, is two people gazing deep into each other's eyes or kissing each other, something like that. He says, but what about this? Imagine two people facing each other in that way and then turning towards the world and looking at it together and moving into it together. That's true love. What if we were like Saint-Exupéry recommends? What if we really loved each other and held everything sacred, held life sacred? What I'm seeking to outline here is integration. Integration of intellect, spirit, body, nature, community. And it's emotion that is the greatest connector of these. It brings them all together. All our emotions, even the most aversive and difficult, especially the most aversive and difficult, are needed for the endless, wonderful struggle ahead. And all of them are love. The end of this civilization is coming, sooner than most people realize. It is itself, this civilization, an endling. What is an endling? It's a wonderful, horrible word. It's the final example that is alive of a species. An endling is the last one alive of a species, so there won't be any more. This civilization is, or at least should be, the last of its kind. What will we allow the process of this civilization's ending to birth? And how are you going to contribute fully to it ending transformatively rather than merely apocalyptically? These are my questions for you here today. Bearing in mind that ending this civilization in the best way possible, being part of a second renaissance, this is a truly tremendous destiny to find one's part in. Destiny. But before hearing that, you all go home on a high. Just to make sure there's been no excuse in my words for the slightest whiff of any kind of false reassurance, take a deep breath, and now let's dive even deeper into the crisis of our civilization, which, as I've been suggesting, is a spiritual crisis at root. It plainly isn't enough anymore to fixate only on slashing carbon emissions. It's way too late for that. We are deep in the danger zone, and we're going deeper. So we have to take seriously building resilience and undertaking adaptation. We have to take seriously strategic adaptation to the crisis. We have to take seriously figuring out and working on how we're going to cope at all levels with the coming storms, the coming droughts, the coming worse than ever heat waves, the wildfires, the kind of thing we're completely unprepared for in this country, the coming disruptions to our food supply systems, and more, and more, and more. So the climate question is bigger and more difficult than most people are still conceptualizing it as. It is much more complex and multifaceted than just one of reducing carbon emissions. And moreover, climate massively overlaps with another question, which is even more difficult and in an even worse state, according to scientists, namely the biodiversity crisis, the extinctions crisis. Probably this is not news to many of you. For example, consider the Amazon, home to so much of the world's biodiversity, and also simultaneously the world's greatest land carbon sink. If we try to fix climate, which is not something we should think of ourselves as doing, as I tried to explain earlier, but if we fantasize that we could fix the climate crisis without looking seriously at biodiversity too, then we haven't even got to first base. Take a deeper breath. We need to go even further. Consider the Ukraine crisis. Anyone who's paying attention can see what the Ukraine crisis reveals to us. That there is a multitude of crises and that they are all interconnected. The cost of living crisis, the inequality crisis, the energy crisis, the climate crisis, the Ukraine crisis. These are really all, to a considerable extent, just different ways of looking at the same thing unfolding in 2024 on this planet. We can't easily pay our bills because we haven't insulated our roofs and we haven't got off fossil, because we haven't reined in the fossil fuel companies and the petro-dictators like Putin. It's for this kind of reason of everything being connected that people are now starting to use this big word, polycrisis. We're in a polycrisis. The climate crisis is the canary in the coal mine of this much bigger, multivalent crisis. So let's go further still into the polycrisis. Into understanding it. I'm just going to offer some tiny snapshots now. Take climate and pandemics. Pandemics are part of the polycrisis. We all kind of know that now because of COVID. But you might not know that there is research suggesting that there are likely going to be many more pandemics as a result of the climate crisis because of the way that it is shifting the populations of, for example, bats, which are one of the main reservoirs of diseases that then come to human beings. So we are likely to have more and worse pandemics in the coming years, very likely to, and the reason is shot through with the climate crisis. See what the polycrisis means? It means the way that these different crises overlap and probabilify each other and make each other worse. There's been a lot of talk recently about AI, rightly so. My own belief as a philosopher is that AI is not what they call an existential threat. I don't think we're potentially entering into a Terminator scenario. You'll be glad to hear. I don't think that will ever occur, or if it does somehow occur, it's far, far from the future. Why? Well, basically because we're nowhere near producing real artificial intelligence yet. AIs can't actually think. They just do unbelievable amounts of complicated computation incredibly quickly, which apes thinking. But make no mistake, AI is with virtual certainty going to have absolutely disastrous consequences for the world in the coming years, as well as the good consequences it's likely to have. It is going to break way more things than Facebook broke. It may well break our politics and our media. So we need to pay serious attention to it, including to efforts to rein it in. And again, it intersects with the climate crisis in numerous ways. But one of the basic ones is that the sheer amount of energy that it takes to train these AIs, for instance, is absolutely phenomenal and terrifying. The climate crisis is what they call a threat multiplier. What that means is that multiple threats are made worse by it. And most terrifying of all probably is the threat of nuclear war. If there are resource wars in years to come, which is likely given how climate breakdown is pressurizing resources, then that makes nuclear war even more likely than it already is. Okay. Okay. I've just given the briefest of outlines of the polycrisis. I'm going to give you one more big word. There's also the way of thinking of all this that is termed the metacrisis. What do people mean if they talk about metacrisis? Well, this term is useful because once you've started to get your head and your feelings around the polycrisis, that's not easy. Once you've started to do that, you start to realise, actually, doesn't all of this, or at least an awful lot of it, get traced back to some much more fundamental root causes of phenomena. A key one of those is that there is, I've been arguing, a fundamental underlying spiritual driver to the crisis. We have to ask, why are we so deep in the polycrisis? Why the climate crisis and more are proving so very hard to get a grip on? A truthful answer must dig deep into why we've allowed ourselves, most of us, most of the time, not to devote our lives and resources to stepping into a full meaning, to head off, and now to cope with a vast and terminal threat or threats. This is not just a crisis of political economy. It is not just a crisis even of how we live in a material sense. It is certainly not just a crisis that can be sorted by any kind of technological fix. Ultimately, I argue that it is a civilizational crisis and a spiritual crisis. So this concept of the meta-crisis says maybe these diverse intersecting crises have some absolutely fundamental common roots. At a meta level, at a more fundamental level, one can start to see why these crises are all coming our way. Here is one such fundamental root of the polycrisis. We are spiritually maladjusted to our home, the earth, at this time in history. And at the same time, we are maladjusted to one another. And this leaves us feeling, as my late colleague David Graeber liked to put it, stuck. Feeling stuck in a dysfunctional civilizational form. So we are in a meta-crisis. To put it collectively and simply, we don't know how to live anymore. We have lost a lot of sight of what most matters. And of course, all of this is just another way of saying once more that this is a matter of meaning. There's an essential philosophical or indeed existential dimension to all this. We need to refigure out how to live, how to exist. Until we do that, this meta-crisis, this polycrisis, are self-evidently not going away, however much we improve our governance or develop our technology. We will cease to exist if we fail to figure out how to make sense of and give meaning to our existence. I want to mention now three great obstacles to tackling adequately the polycrisis and the meta-crisis, including the climate crisis, of course. Three gigantic processes standing directly in our way. The first of these is polarization, which we've all seen becoming a severe problem in recent years. We in the Climate Majority Project are very, very concerned about this. We are aiming to try to procreate a movement, or a movement of movements, or one might say a new highly distributed wave of action, which combats polarization, because across many different influential aspects of our lives, it brings people together to face these existential threats. Extinction Rebellion, which I helped to launch, was not in a position to do this, partly because Extinction Rebellion deliberately polarized. I mean, it deliberately forced a difficult national conversation. It did so brilliantly, but you can't go on polarizing if you want to sort problems that require a post-polarized society. There is no possible way of making real progress on climate, let alone on other aspects of the polycrisis, without societies which are broadly internally aligned. So incredibly difficult though it is, we have to work together to overcome polarization, the weaponization of different identities. That's the first obstacle. The second is perhaps even harder. It's the simple plain existence of capitalist markets and of limited liability companies, which face quasi-legal obligations to maximize their short-term profits and returns to shareholders. I'm not going to say much about this because it's incredibly hard to deal with and so requires longer than I have here. I want to acknowledge, firstly, that this is something which makes it systemically hard to imagine really being able to handle successfully these elements of polycrisis that I've outlined, including, of course, the climate crisis, and secondly, that we have to try. We have to try to put ourselves in a position to make this effort through, I would argue, the kind of bottom-up transformative work and the potential change of political culture that could result from the coming to consciousness of the climate majority. We have to actually start to retame markets and limited liability companies in particular. In the Climate Majority Project, for us, this takes the form, crucially, of our Regulate Us campaign, in which we're saying to businesses, look, what you need to do is to say to government, regulate us. We businesses don't have the power to sort this out through innovation or technology alone. You need to intervene to make it easier for us to seek to work on a higher level playing field rather than participating in a race to the bottom. Regulate us. The final process I want to mention, the final great obstacle, is arguably the hardest of all. It is great power competition. Because if we imagine making some progress on, for example, taming AI and on getting off fossil, and so starting to really deal with climate and so forth, if we imagine all this only in, say, Europe, well, how much of a difference will that make to what happens in, say, China or Russia? And insofar as you've got one major power or superpower or power bloc, especially an undemocratic one, that is continuing to exacerbate these crises, including, of course, as a byproduct, the climate crisis. Insofar as this is the case, then there are built-in drivers for others to continue to do the same. This is a kind of dynamic of rivalry, which is even harder to leash than the difficult dynamics of market rivalry. Though the two dynamics, of course, tend to interrelate and mutually reinforce. This geopolitical dynamic of rivalry as a barrier to dealing with the polycrisis is incredibly hard to get around. But there are, to a degree, precedents. We managed successfully to ban most biological weaponry and chemical weaponry, and to some extent, nuclear weaponry. We managed to successfully tackle the ozone hole in the 1980s, which is encouraging as a partial precedent. Although note that the ozone hole problem was something like a problem, rather than a predicament, like climate is. It was much simpler, it was much more specific than the climate issue is. And it was not troubled by, for example, the temptations that are on superpowers, etc., now to allow AI to let rip, driven on by market competition. Great power competition, geopolitics, is, I think, possibly the greatest of all the obstacles that we face. It's going to require the advent of ecological diplomacy, for powers to get together, to face together what is coming, or we won't make it. And that is a huge ask. Ecological diplomacy is a huge thing to ask for in a deeply divided world, where polarization and competition are themselves being driven and exploited. So all this is tough. To return to a line of argument I developed earlier, it's very tough to face. That's why we have to do this shared inner work. That's why we have to face all this together. This is all part of the journey that we're now on. And I hope you can see in this whistle-stop tour that climate is really, well, the thick end of a very large wedge. When you see that wedge properly, when you start to bring the polycrisis and the metacrisis into focus, you see more clearly than ever that system change is needed, and also how very hard it's going to be to have that system change be the kind of system change we want and need. Which, not incidentally, underlines again the importance of engaging in adaptation, because it is just extremely reckless and naive now to assume that we're going to succeed in undertaking a green transition. Let me reframe slightly. System change is coming. It's going to happen. Before you get too excited or optimistic about that, the way it's coming is either that we will successfully manage to undertake transformations that will make some significant inroad into the polycrisis, including crucially into the climate crisis, or we will collapse. So system change is coming. This civilization as we know it is coming to an end. The question is whether we can manage to make that end transformational and broadly tolerable, and indeed in some ways truly wonderful, or not. To come back in my final remarks squarely to climate. Climate remains the white swan in the room. What do I mean by that? You may have heard of this concept of black swans. My friend and colleague Nassim Taleb famously argued this in relation to the financial crisis, that crisis in 2007 onwards was not something that anyone saw coming, or rather, to be precise, not something that anyone except he and one or two other people literally saw coming. Black swans are things that people don't see coming. And we can see the outlines of all these things that I'm talking about, but we don't know for sure what form they will take. In most cases, we don't know for certain if they will happen, but with climate, we do. Climate breakdown is a white swan. It is coming right at us. We might, with luck, escape nuclear war. We might, with some luck, collectively escape fatal pandemics. But all the luck in the world is not going to enable us to escape full-scale climate breakdown. It is what is going to happen unless we deliberately, transformationally change course. We have to make something much greater and more reliable. than luck. So I want to urge you, among the broad vision I've been trying to paint here, don't be distracted. We need to look deep into the climate and nature crisis. We need to concentrate on what we can see there, which interconnects with all the other crises. When we do this, we are looking deep into ourselves. The microcosm is the macrocosm. We need to concentrate on what we can find there, on what we can find here, what we can see and feel deep in our souls, deep in our failing civilization, and behind what it conceals, deep in our profound interrelatedness with each other, and with all life on this infinitely precious planet, and deep in what we would so like to avert from. When we look, there is the gift. There are the very difficult emotions that arise, the kind of difficult emotions that no doubt some of you are feeling right now. When we look deep into the climate crisis and see there the polycrisis and the metacrisis, and see deep into ourselves, there are the so-called negative emotions, eco-anxiety, heartbreak, even despair. But what I've been trying to say is, they're not really negative. They feel bad, but they're actually good. These emotions and the art of enabling their transformation will be the making of us. Of that, I am really rather confident. And remember, they all arise from love. Just go deeply into that one more time. Why are we angry? We're angry because we want to defend what we love and we're fiercely protective of it. Why are we fearful? We're fearful for ourselves and for others that we love. Fearful of what is definitely maybe going to be coming for them, for us. Why do we despair if we do? Because we can't seem to bear the situation we sometimes see or sense or feel when we actually allow ourselves to open to the situation as it is, and we can't yet see any way forward. All of these difficult emotions, they all arise from love. They are forms of love. These difficult emotions are rational. They're beautiful. If you're not sometimes afraid now, you're not paying attention. If you don't from time to time feel desperate now, you're probably not fully facing into what I've been outlining here this afternoon. If you're not sometimes yet deeply affected by grief about our situation, then either you haven't looked at it fully, or there's something missing in you, or you're numbing it out. These difficult emotions are rational, and they are a huge and growing reservoir of energy. Fully embraced, they are all we need. Fully embraced, loved, rather than rejected, treated as energy. Truly they are what we need and even all we need, because they make what can seem to one to be impossible, possible, as well as necessary. You can work on these feelings with a therapist or counsellor, or better still with a peer group, or with the Climate Majority Project Climate Courage campaign, or through the work that reconnects, or through the work of moral imaginations, or in places like this lecture hall here today. The love that we are, whether taking form as effort, as sacrifice, as giving, as joyfulness, as grief-strickenness, as worry, as desperation, as presence, the love that we are and the love that we project for our children, for life itself, this love is an indescribable gift and truly mighty power. And I want to ask you to let yourself fall deep into it. And what that means is falling deep into and through all of us. Whether or not we survive, whether or not we flourish, the wonderful truth that I have tried to offer here this evening, the wonderful truth of the gift nested within the trial through which we are now inevitably starting to pass. This wonder and this truth is in the end greater than the horrible, difficult facts out of which it arises. The wonderful truth is that while it's the end, the moment is being prepared for, and the better we prepare, the better the ending. So it's the end of the beginning. It's the end we start from. And one more use of the word end. To what end do we strive? This meaning of the word end is what Aristotle means to highlight when he draws our attention to what he calls final causes. What draws something towards itself, the telos, the final cause, the reason. The end of the beginning is seeing the point of the suffering that we are undergoing if we are lucky enough to be feeling it now, while society is still relatively stable, rather than later when many others will feel it, when society may be much more fragile. The end of the beginning is getting the point, finding the meaning, unlocking the great secret of this crisis, that actually being willing to go through it is itself the way not to be swallowed without residue by it. There is a great cause, a great end, drawing us, setting us in motion, bringing us out of our small selves, giving us purpose, giving us a cause, giving us good cause, bringing us together. There really is a very real sense in which this time we are all in it together. So I want to ask you to let yourself be carried forward by the motion of emotion and by the rational emotions implicit in this wonderful motion. It's the end. Now, at last, in truth, we can really begin.